Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. We are in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. We'll begin in verse 2. We'll do a little bit of background here. And what's basically taking place is in chapter 10, Paul's been talking about pagan worship as far as, starting way back in chapter 7 about the concerns with the pagan worships and the things that they've been being drawn into that. And now in chapter 11, he's going to begin talking about Christian services. Now how the culture possibly has come into the church, and they're starting to be distracted from the traditions or the things that Paul's handed down to them and adapting to the way that the secular society does. Or vice versa. They're breaking some social standards with their new church services. So basically, they just finished talking about pagan services. Now they're going to start talking through chapter 11 and 12 about Christian services. And there's several topics that are going to come up. First of all, today we're going to talk about the head coverings, great topic here today, head coverings in chapter 11 of how to, long hair, head coverings, what's going on with this. You can see in verse 17 they're going to be talking about the Lord's Supper and the practice there. And then chapter 12, they're going to start talking about spiritual gifts in the Christian church service. So these chapters, there's three different subjects basically we talk about in the Christian service. The one important thing is, not one important thing, but one thing to notice in chapter 12, verse 1, he says, now about spiritual gifts, or now about spirituals. That is how he addresses an answer to a question that they've written to him. So we assume, again, there's so much assuming and pieces we're missing. So you got to be kind of careful. But we assume, because of the way this is written, that in chapter 12, verse 1, he's addressing a question that they've written to him in a letter. Different than chapter 11, where he talks about two subjects, the head coverings and the practice of the Lord's Supper, which appears not to have been in the letter, but maybe comes as a report. The group that brought the group of elders or leaders that came over from Chloe's household have brought up two issues. And he says, okay, here's a couple things I want to address that you haven't written about, and that's in chapter 11. And then chapter 12, he returns to answering their letter. But they're still categorized as far as now he's moved from pagan worship and how the Christians deal with pagan worship practices, and now how they're going to deal with Christian services, both separating from the pagans, but also staying in line with their society. So part of this is going to be some social issues here. Well, I'm going to pray, and then we're going to take a look at this. It's kind of a tough set of verses because there's I'll show you, there's so many strange things, and you can go so many different ways with certain topics or certain words. Father, we come to you today in the name of Jesus. We do thank you for the chance to look into your word. We thank you for the truth that you presented to us. I do ask that you lead and guide us as we look at these things, that we may find application for our own lives and in our own times. Again, we thank you for your spirit. We thank you for fellowship with other believers. And we do thank you especially today for your word and the truth that we have here preserved for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, first of all, on your notes, I do want to point these things out. Just that first page. Like I said, the first line right there, it says Paul has just finished talking about pagan religious services, chapter 14, or up through chapter 14. Now he's going to talk about Christian services. Then he goes on to that first four bullet points. How I mentioned here, as many people do. I mean, I'm not going to give you anything that's unique today because we're just studying other sources and different people. But how little is known about first century worship services. You really have to read this. You really have to, almost in a sense, step away from your Western church Christian experience and try to see it the way it was in this time. It's on the other side of the world. It's 2,000 years ago. It's brand new. There's nothing necessary for them to copy, except they are influenced by the Jewish synagogue service. They are influenced by their own society. They know nothing of what we know as church and seminary and the hierarchy and the bulletin, especially when you get to chapter 12. There's that verse in chapter 12 that really bothers me. It says, if someone is speaking and something comes to another speaker, the first speaker should stop and let the second speaker continue. It's like, well, it ain't going to happen. I'm not going to stop and let you finish the service, But I mean, yeah, exactly. But so I mean, it's like, and then then go to church with a bulletin, and then you got a sequence of events you got to be done in 60 minutes. It doesn't appear to be at all like that. So again, we're not rejecting what the church is doing today. We're just trying to separate from that and look at this with fresh eyes. So here's some things. There's 4 points, number 1 through 4. We don't know about the time or frequency of their gatherings. We don't know. We assume they met on Sunday. But historically, it tends that Saturdays, up until almost 325, is when they made the actual break to Sundays, when Constantine said Sunday was the day of the Christian church met. So you've got 300 years there where you're not really sure where they're meeting. And if they do, they're meeting, it talks about meeting early the first day. They may be meeting as the sun is coming up for a group of Christians before they go to work. So they didn't have the Sabbath day like we have, like on a Sunday where it's the weekend. They didn't have a weekend. The Jews still had the Sabbath, but the Christians may have been meeting early on Sunday morning. But it wasn't Sunday as far as the end of the weekend. It was Monday, the first day of the week, actually, for them. So we don't even know if they met during the week, if they met daily. I mean, these are some questions we've got. The places of gatherings. We assume they met in homes. Eventually they're going to be meeting like in Rome and stuff. In the catacombs, they're going to start hiding. In secret, when they started being persecuted, they're going to start hiding when they're misunderstood by society. But they definitely don't have churches. They're probably meeting in homes. The kinds of gatherings. What's interesting here is we see in these two chapters, 11 and 12, they're going to be meeting for meals. Now, we assume, in my Western mind, I assume they're going to meet for a church service, which includes a time of prayer. It appears some prophesying. It includes the Lord's Supper, which includes everybody, getting in a little row and having a little piece of bread, a little cup of juice. And then, some kind of a church service where there's speaking going on. But as you look at it, they may be three different events where they're meeting in someone's home for the Lord's Supper, because it wasn't just a cup and a little piece of bread like we, in churches today. They're having a meal. They were bringing in meals, food. It's like a potluck, if you would. And then at some point, either they'd celebrate the Lord's Supper, or they'd celebrate the Lord's Supper and then eat a meal. I don't want to say it as an exact statement, but remember, these people are Corinthians, used to the pagan culture of having family meals in the temple. And now they're simply going, we'll celebrate the Lord's Supper at your house tonight, and we won't meet in the temple, but we'll meet here. And that could involve a whole meal, just like they're used to eating meals in the temples of the gods. So they're bringing that culture. They didn't all of a sudden become, Western Americans in the 21st century and have potlucks and little piece of bread and little plastic cups of juice. They would have taken their culture over. Paul would have instructed them, and they're not shifting. So they may be meeting for meals, which would include the Lord's Supper of some sort. And how they celebrate that is still, we got some ideas. The other thing we see a meeting for is prayer and prophesying. Is that separate than the time where they meet together for the teaching? Then as we get into chapter 12, we see about them. They're singing songs. So a song may come to someone. They didn't have hymnals. They may have developed as the church develops. They may have sung standardized some kind of verses or a collection of songs they may have sung. But it appears the singing may be even more in line early on, in line with the prophesying, where a song makes a word of encouragement, or a song may come to someone right during the church service. So it's not like someone starts singing, well, what page is that on? I don't know, we've never heard this song before. Someone's just singing. And so it's not nearly as structured. So when they would meet together, they may have already had the supper like earlier in the week. They may have met together for prophesying. And they may not have had someone stand up and teach like this. They may not have had someone stand up and just, expound on Christian doctrine and read. They didn't have, a text. Everybody didn't have their Bible. They did not, but everybody's got their Bible. They didn't have that. They may have had a copy of one of Paul's letters. For example, this letter right here, the 1 Corinthians, they would have gotten, that's more like a newsletter or an instruction for the leadership of the church. Straighten these things out. They wouldn't have, everybody made a copy. That's going to go to verse, 2 of chapter 13 or something. They would have read that and tried to make corrections in their church. Eventually those letters were canonized and put together here, and we can refer to them. But what were they talking about? What were they teaching? We talked on Tuesday night about guest speakers traveling. The gift of teaching would travel through the churches, and they'd spend, eventually by the time of the turn of the century, by 100 AD, the end of John's life, the teachers would show up, and if they were there if they were there for more than 3 or 4 days, they're not a true teacher. If you're there for a 4th or 5th day, we're done feeding you, we're done housing you, you need to get a job. You don't just come in and just, live on the Christian community. You can come in for 3 days, teach, eat our food, sleep in our houses, but on the 4th day, we'll give you a sandwich and a plastic bag and send you to the next town. You don't just stay as a teacher, you travel as a teacher, because again, that was a lot of the source of the information came from those people that had been trained or been with the apostles, and they had the information. So again, we don't understand necessarily the services. And the leadership role, we are used to a pastor leading the service, but in these chapters, especially in chapter 12, you begin to see there's some kind of leadership. There's elders. Paul always established elders, but the church often was led by the community, it appears. So again, we got to be careful as we approach this. The reason I'm going over those things is when we read this, we can't just shove this into a first century or a 21st century church. We don't know a lot of the details that are going on there in the first century. Next, it says these are the next three sections, and this I've already referred to this, but number 1, verses 2 through 16 in chapter 11 are the head coverings, prayer, and prophesying. I'll probably say it again, but just so we don't forget. In chapter 12, it's going to start talking about prophesying and women prophesying, and it almost gives you an impression that women can't prophesy, but the problem with that is here in chapter 11, it gives you instructions on how a woman should behave while she is prophesying. So it's like, well, I thought in chapter 12, women can't prophesy, only men can prophesy. Well, yeah, but in chapter 11, women are told how they should prophesy. So it's like, what's going on here? But anyway, it's going to talk about head coverings, prayer, and prophesying. In chapter 11, verses 17 through 34, which hopefully we'll do that next week, it's talking about the Lord's Supper. And some things we can assume here is in the Lord's Supper, there seemed to be a social breakdown. The rich people would sit over here and eat. Those that didn't have as much food would bring their food over here. And these people had an excessive amount of food. So they came in as believers, but they would separate into social classes. And Paul even refers to them, these guys having wine, drinking so much wine that they may have been drunk. They drank so much wine. Where these people over here barely had enough to get through the meal. And so it's like, share your potluck. So in other words, what I'm going to point out there is we can see later on in this chapter, there was a social distinction. As they would meet together, they had a hard time mingling together socially, and they'd go off into groups of people and kind of keep their own little groups together. And that's going to maybe give us a little insight into what's going on here in these first verses. Number 3, in chapters 12 through 14 actually, let's begin talking about the abuse of speaking in tongues in the assembly and how that leads into a bunch of other spiritual gifts. We'll talk about that when we get there. I do want to talk about the next thing right there. These verses are difficult, and here's some difficult things. And when I get done reading this, I'm going to read through chapter 11 up through this part today so you can hear some of these things, and then we'll start teaching it. These verses are difficult because the flow of logic is difficult. What is Paul talking about? When he talks about the man being the head, is he trying to put women in their place? Is he trying to establish order? All of a sudden he's talking about Christ and God. He's jumping over. All of a sudden he's talking about long hair, proper hair condition. Like, what are you saying, Paul? For them, it would have made sense. For us, we don't even know the problem necessarily. So the flow of logic is difficult. Uncertainty about the culture, we've referred to this, historical setting, and customs which Paul and the readers understand. I will say this as we go through this. One of the things I'm leaving open as we look at this is Paul is not necessarily talking about, and be careful as I say this, I think this is important. There are spiritual truths and Christian realities. This is the way God wants things done. This is truth in God's divine viewpoint. That is taken and placed into your culture. Now, as he placed that into your culture, there's already some things established in your culture. Just like things in your family. Each of us has our own family. And if you came to my house on Christmas morning or you came to my house on a Saturday morning, there's a certain way we do things in our house. Not right or wrong, it's just the way we do things. And if you came from your family into my house on Christmas morning, or came from your family into my house on Saturday night or Friday night, it's like, that's not the way we do things. We order pizza and watch movies on Friday night. We don't, whatever you want to do. This is our Christmas morning. We open presents and then we eat breakfast. And when we eat breakfast, this is what we have. We have it every year. And it's like, what's that got to do with Christianity? Nothing. It's got to do with the culture in my house. This is the way my boys are used to it. This is just the way we do things. It's not right or wrong. It's just if you come into my house and you're going to function socially in my family, you need to kind of flow with us here. Because this is expected as this is right and this is wrong, this is normal. And so God's got this absolute truth that He's setting into the Corinthian culture, or whatever culture it is. And there's already some standards and norms there on how to behave. What does it mean? And this may explain a little bit about the long hair and the things we're going to be getting to, the head coverings, this is the way. We already know the pagans in their pagan temple services, there's certain things they're going to shy away from. And some of this stuff's going to try to bleed into the Christian church. And Paul puts a barrier up and says, no, that's not coming into the Christian church. But yet that's not to say that everything the pagan society, secular society does is wrong. There are some standards that if you're a Christian you need to follow. For example, the speed limit. It's like if you go to Colorado, the law is you can smoke marijuana. That doesn't make it right. That just means that's their law. Let them smoke marijuana. We're not going to smoke marijuana in church. Okay? Well, also in Colorado, or Nebraska, you go through Nebraska, the speed limit changes. Well, we're going to follow that law because that's the law of the land. And if you're going the wrong speed limit in Nebraska, you're going to get pulled over and get a ticket. So in other words, there's certain laws we're not going to discount, or we're not going to consider them right. We're going to do it the correct way. There's certain laws or social standards that when you bring over Christian doctrine, you've got to make it fit with what is right. If it's in my house or it's in your culture. So understand, some of the things Paul is going to be addressing may not be Christian standards as much as they are social standards that the Christians are no longer following, and they're going to get themselves in trouble with society because you're breaking down the social standards. Just like, if you came and wanted to, eat something different on Christmas morning at my house for breakfast. We don't have a big dinner, we have a big breakfast. We don't eat turkey, we eat pancakes or something. Okay, now here we go on with this. The uncertainty of certain words. The word head, verses 3 and 5. What does the word head mean? We'll talk about that. But listen, what does the word head refer to? Having down the head in verse 4. That's the Greek translation. Having down the head. What's that mean? Uncovered. Glory. When we say talks about glory, what is it referring to? Glory. The authority over her head. What does it refer to? The authority over the woman's head. Here's a good one, verse 10. And all this comes down to, at one point Paul says, because of the angels, do it right. What do you mean because are there angels here? How's the angels playing into this? And again, people have got ideas, but no one really knows what Paul means. He says, because of the angels. I can give you an idea. Here's what I think. But Paul says, he doesn't even explain. If I say because of the angels, this is the way we're going to do it. You'd be like, what is he talking about? But you would assume, if I would say just a blank statement, I would assume that you knew what I was referring to. So Paul assumes when he says because of the angels, this is the way we're going to do it. In the place of a shawl, such a custom. Now again, what is a custom? What's he referring to? Such a custom. Is he talking about social standards? Or is he talking about a Christian tradition handed down by the apostles? And then this one right here, the words translated man and woman. You could go back and read this as this whole chapter, man and woman, man and woman, man and woman. Or go back and read it, husband and wife, husband and wife, husband and wife. It's like, which way are you going to translate that word? It's going to determine how it all comes together. Now again, it's all fitting, it's all accurate, it's all the Word of God, but how we approach it is going to be a little bit difficult. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read chapter 11, verse 2 up through verse 16. And do realize, why aren't we reading chapter 11, verse 1? I think that's the end of his previous discussion, talking about food sacrificed to idols. And remember last week what he was talking about was, and we've talked about this the last several weeks, is you have certain rights, you have certain privileges, but you need to make sure that your privileges and your rights are set aside when you're ministering or living with other, if it be pagans or with Christians, so that you represent, everything you do is done for the glory of God, not for your own benefit. Sometimes there's benefits, but if it comes down to choosing your own rights and benefits and presenting the Lord or presenting a correct understanding, you sacrifice your rights and do what's best for your representation of the Lord. And so that's what he says right here in chapter 11, verse 1, right in there, as we finish chapter 10. For I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many. I've already been saved. I've already got the advantages. I'm already growing in Christ. I'm not just going to use all that stuff for my own advantage. I'm now going to seek the advantage of the lost believer or the lost pagan, or helping instruct the believer who's growing. So it's no longer what's important for me. What will help the lost and believer grow. So in other words, the good of many, so that they may be saved. Verse 1 of chapter 11, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. In other words, Paul ends up saying, follow me as I follow Christ. That's exactly the way Christ ministered, was he was seeking the benefit of others. He was okay. He was trying to seek the benefit of others. So he says, I'm following Christ, you follow me, and we're all going the same direction. That ends that chapter talking about pagan worship. Now, chapter 11, verse 2 through 16. I'm going to try to do something, as you know, it's difficult. I'm going to read without stopping and explaining anything. Here we go. Chapter 11, verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings just as I pass them on to you. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved, she should cover her head. A man ought to cover his head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. In other words, that last point, if anyone wants to argue with me, understand, we're not talking about this. We don't do it any other way, nor do the churches that follow God. End of discussion. Okay, we agree, Paul, but what did you just say? What did you just say? So here we go. Let's look again at the notes here very quickly. Chapter 11, verse 2. Holding to my teachings, I passed on them to you. It says, I passed them on is the translation. You see the word right there in bold. Paradoka, which means to deliver or pass on. It's you've got some kind of instruction, and you pass on. And teaching is the same word, same root word, paradosis. It's a technical term in Judaism for the oral transmission of religious teaching. In other words, when Paul sat under Gamaliel, he received the oral transmission, the instructions. This involves handing down, doctrinal truth, but also handing down tradition. So part of the things that's coming up in this is we're going to have, I'll write the word truth. We're going to have traditions. And again, when we say traditions, truth is absolute. Traditions is the way we practice these absolute truths. Doesn't mean they're right or wrong. It's just the way it keeps us all in step so we all know what each other's doing. And then we're going to have social standards. Because once you go into, and again, these are not wrong. You can't confuse social standards with absolute truth. And you know this, but you can see, you look back in your Christian life, how you can navigate through certain things. From one society to another, you can practice Christianity. You can meet, anytime on Sunday. You can meet anytime during the week. This is your social standards. The truth would be, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. You need to be meeting as believers. When you meet, where you meet, that's a social standard. So, we always meet at 6 o'clock on Sunday nights. That doesn't matter. But we always meet. That's the important part. And so again, and traditions. This would be, maybe where you're seated, how the church is organized or whatever. So you've got truth, traditions, and then social standards. And Paul is here in a sense referring to these things right here. He's handed down some truth, apostolic doctrine, and some traditions. This is the way we're going to function. This is where we're going to practice these things. And traditions are kind of an understanding, the way they've kind of developed. They can change over time, but this is kind of the way we do things. You take this and you plug it into Jerusalem, you're going to have to plug this truth and the traditions into the Jewish society without offending Jewish society. You understand, a lot of times Christians in the past, especially in the early church, they would get persecuted because they took their truth and traditions and ignored social standards. And it's like people misunderstood your truth and your traditions because all we see you doing is you never follow the speed limit. It's like, it's not about the speed limit, but that's all we see. Or if you're in Corinth, or if you're in Rome, you take your truth and traditions and you have to fit them into Roman society. Understand how different is Jerusalem from Corinth, and Corinth from barbarians up north that they haven't even heard of Christianity yet. So you're going to have to adjust this. This always stays the same, but you've got to take into social standards into account. Okay, so Paul has handed them down some traditions, some truth and some traditions. And it's, again, this is a tough verse right here. He says, I praise you for remembering everything. Now remember, this is not part of the questions or the letter they wrote. In chapter 12 he says, now about spiritual gifts. He's going to be answering a question they wrote about. Something is going on in the church. I'm going to assume, and this is a guess, that the people that brought the letter over have said to him, here's what's going on. They're meeting on Sundays like you told us to. I don't know if this is what it is. And they're gathering together, and they're celebrating the Lord's Supper. They're meeting together, they're praying, they're prophesying, everything's going fine. And so Paul says, I praise you for remembering me. You're meeting together, you're having some prayer services, you're celebrating the Lord's Supper. I praise you, you've left the pagan temple and you've come over and you've started the church. Congratulations. I praise you for following what I've taught you, following my traditions. But we've got some problems here. You're celebrating the Lord's Supper, but we're going to have to correct some things you're doing. And that's what he's doing right here. I praise you for remembering the very fact that you're meeting together as a church. Congratulations. But when you get together, there's some problems that are taking place. So I think that's why some people want to say he's being sarcastic, especially since he's chewed them out now for 10 chapters. And then he says, I praise you for remembering me in everything. It's like, what? They haven't remembered you in anything, Paul. You're trying to tell them, remember what I taught you. So I'm assuming he's not being sarcastic. He's telling him, you are doing some things I've called you. I praise you that you're actually here, that I can correct. I don't have to try to start the church. I just need to kind of correct the church. So I praise you for remembering these things. That's how I'm going to approach this. And again, you can see right there the different discussions there. We now move into this, verse 3. The use of the word head. And all the way through this, you are free. Paul's writing, and Paul knows what he says. And at the end, Paul says, we have no other practice. If you want to be contentious about this, forget it. This is the way we're going to do it. I'm going to agree with what Paul says. But I wish Paul was here to answer some questions. So as I explain I'm now explaining what Paul says. I just want to agree with Paul. I don't want to rephrase and explain what Paul says because I'm not always sure. And again, anybody who comes up and says there's no question on there, I've got this nailed down, means you probably haven't studied anything. You probably got your own ideas, so you're going to roll right through this. And you probably have more questions than you've got answers. But the use of the word head, it appears, is used metaphorically and literally. In other words, head as in the woman's physical head or the man's head, but then metaphorically as the head. Like in our country, in our culture, the word head, like head of state, that means leader. Now, this is argued in dictionaries, in lexicons, in word studies. Is the word head, I'm going to show you some things. And this is just information you could use this piece or this piece and plug it in. But if you use the wrong piece, this next verse doesn't make any sense. You take that piece out, plug this, they both could work. Plug this piece in, does that help explain this next verse? So you're kind of putting together a puzzle as you're walking through this. So in our culture, the word head means leader, the top, the one that goes first, the priority. But also, I'm going to show you some words here. The word head also means source, means the origin, where it comes from. So here we go. If you look at the notes right there on top of page 2, the word, when it's in all capital letters, that's used metaphorically. When it's in, smaller letters, the smaller case, it means the literal, like the head on your shoulders. So you can see this right here. It says, but I want you to understand that the head, metaphorically, whatever that means, if it means the leader, I'll explain this to you again in the Greek words in just a minute. Does it mean the leader, like the head of state, the one who's got the authority? Or does it mean the source, where it originated from? Either way. But I want you to understand that the head, metaphorically, of every man is Christ. The man, the head of woman. God, the head of Christ. So right there, the head of every man is, the leader of every man is Christ. The leader of every woman is man. The leader of Christ is God. Or the source of every man is Christ. The source of woman is man. The source of Christ, the Christos, the Messiah, is God. God sent the Messiah. That's metaphorically. Every man praying or prophesying. There you go. There's our first activity in the church that we're addressing. Praying or prophesying. Now, if they're praying or prophesying, remember, they're the ones that are going to be, the attention's going to be on them. Now again, not in a bad, it's just they're the ones, again, this is not private. This is not private because you can't prophesy. Prophesying really helps. If you just said praying, it'd create a whole other vacuum of problems for us. Because like, you can pray anywhere. You can pray while you're driving a car. You can pray in your prayer closet. You can pray out loud publicly. You can pray in a gathering with everybody praying at the same time. But once you throw the word prophesying in there, all of a sudden it limits it. You're no longer prophesying in your closet. You're no longer everybody prophesying at the same time. You're now somehow, everyone is now listening to you pray or listening to you prophesy. It puts you in a public service with you speaking, not necessarily as the head or the clergy or the priest or the prophet or the pastor or the ordained one, but the one speaking at that time. Okay. So every man praying or prophesying, I'm assuming that's in public, having down against the head, that's what it says in the Greek, having down against, meaning you've got to translate that, down against the head. Every woman praying or prophesying uncovered as to the head. Now that is no longer metaphorical, we're assuming that's literal, talking about the head, the physical head. For it is one and the same thing for her to be one who is shaved. And that means shorn or shaved. Her head is shaved. There's no hair on her head. What's that mean? In our culture, what does it mean? I mean, it means chemo. I mean, what does it mean to have there's no hair on your head? What does it mean? And there, it has to mean something. I mean, everybody has strange haircuts in our culture. You know, guys that go bald since the days of Michael Jordan. If you start your receding hairline, you shave your head, you look like Michael Jordan. So I mean, does that mean Michael Jordan was wrong for shaving his head, or a woman's got chemo? I mean, no. We got to leave all that stuff behind and find out what does Paul mean to in 55 AD. What does he mean to the Corinthians? For it is one and the same thing for her to be one who is shaved. For if a woman will not be covered, let her also be shorn. So in other words, if you're not going to cover up your head, then we're going to shave off your hair. We're not going to put up with it. And then you don't want to have your head shaved. You know what that means, don't you? No, we don't. How bad is that? But it is disgrace for her to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. In other words, he's not saying now if you don't cover your head, we're going to have, after church service, we're going to have all the women that didn't have their head covered, we're going to shave your head off on the way out the door. I think he's using an illustration. If you're not going to cover up your head, that's embarrassing. That's disgraceful. You might as well shave your head. You want us to shave your head? No, you don't want us to shave your head because that would be disgraceful. So the same thing, cover up your head when you pray. He's pretty adamant. He says, you want to be contentious? We don't have any other practice. So he's not saying we're going to shave your head. He's saying it's the same thing as if you were shaved, and you don't want to have your head shaved. You know what that means? So cover up your head. It means the same thing in church if your head's not covered and you're praying. Okay, well, here we go. The uncovered, according to the Septuagint. See, LXX, that means 70. That's the Septuagint, supposedly 70 scribes translated the Hebrew text into Greek in Alexandria, so that's what they call it, the 70. Uncovered, according to the Septuagint, may refer to loosened hair. This was one option. And we'll develop this as we look at some things right here. Meaning, they translated the Hebrew word, the same Hebrew word, and they translate over. It means loosened hair. Instead of having it braided, pulled up, meaning taken care of, it's just loose. It's down around the shoulders. It's just the long hair, and it's uncovered. And so loosened hair would be, in a sense, a problem. So to let her hair down in public was a disgrace. In other words, it might have meant, again, there's several options. It may have been a sign of the only time you saw a woman's hair actually down and loose would be in a private setting, like in a bedroom or something like this. Or, worse, even prostitution. And prostitution could play into this. And so a woman that was presenting herself publicly would have her hair up, and I can show you examples of this. By this time, by 55 AD, I don't want to get too far ahead of my notes here, but by 55 AD, the woman's hair was braided. Peter even refers to this, about her hair being braided. Don't let your beauty come from braided hair, but on the inner beauty. And what tended to follow the imperial family is no different than People magazine or what's on TV, you know, what's Kardashians or whatever. I don't even know what that word means. But it's like whatever they put out there, it's like, oh, everybody's got a have you seen trends change? You know, yes, I mean like a pendulum. And so the same thing, if the imperial family did a certain thing, it swept through culture. A little bit slower than us today, because you can have something change over the weekend. How many guys have dumped ice on yourself and took some kind of a pledge? Okay. Yeah, no, I haven't either. But anyway, it's like that's trending right now. That's a phrase on Facebook, or you know, what's trending? Well, what was trending since the days of probably this time was the imperial cult was they braid their hair, sometimes in a loop, tied up around their head, and that was the way they present themselves. That meant you were proper, you were dressed up, you were distinguished. And the only time your hair would be loosed and hanging down would refer to, again, some kind of a private setting. And so there's a problem. If you had loose hair, you need to get it covered up. You need to get it tied up. You need to do something with your hair. You just can't have it hanging down loose. Okay, but there's 1,000 things to look at here, so let me see if I can keep going. There was some covering the woman was wearing, which is literally called a wraparound. So in other words, if your hair was loose, not taken, you could put some kind of a covering on your head. So instead of tying it up in, like Nero's mother, Agrippina, she would, Agrippina was her name, she actually was the one that helped start this. She a big braid, long, and then wrapped it around her head. And everybody saw that, oh, that's so cool. Then everybody started doing it. Well, if you weren't going to have time to braid your hair and decorate it, you would just cover your hair up. You'd somehow, so you were in public, it was still tied up. It would be called a wraparound or something. The traditional answer that you can see many times is this, the women were being insubordinate to their husbands because of their newfound freedom in Christ. That's one answer. This is off subject here, but one thing is we do have a problem with women sometimes experiencing in this book. They're at the eschatological, they found their freedom in Christ, they're pushing ahead, they're not staying in sync with culture, they're going on to the new age, you know, the millennium age, or there's no separation of men and women, and it's like they're breaking rank with family, with society. And we can see that in Thessalonica, we can see that in other places here, where they're breaking rank with the social standards, and you're going to get in trouble, not because of your truth that you're holding to, not because of your church traditions, but you're taking these things out of sync, and you're breaking social standards, and now you're going to have conflict. That's one traditional thought. So some would assume that throughout these verses, Paul is telling women to get back in line with, not this, but the application of this to their social setting, their social standards. And that's the next point right there. Let's look on to, I got more I'm going to read there in just a minute. Let's go on to the bottom of page 2. The head. I want to point this out. The word head. In our modern language, it means the leader. There's two words right here. You can see they're in bold. It means the leader, or it means the source, the river source. The head is the beginning. In fact, it says the word arche, or beginning, is used interchangeable with the word kephale, or the head, which is in some of these manuscripts. So in other words, sometimes this word that is translated head in our English is the same word that would mean the beginning. And they're used interchangeably. They're like synonyms. So it kind of helps give credence that this is not talking about the leadership. And some would say, some commentators, some word specialists, the exegetical researchers, they say they did not understand head as leadership. They would have understood head as the word head. Now again, you can't go by your English translations, because we're translating certain words in the Old Testament and New Testament as head, like the head of the tribes. Different word. But the word that's translated here would mean source and beginning. I'm not arguing for this. I'm just saying there's a reason to go with this idea of the source. And here's a quote. For example, an example from a passage about Zeus, not scriptural. You can see it right there at bottom page 2. Zeus is the head. Zeus is the middle. In Zeus, all is complete. Now that's not my Christian doctrine, but that is how they use the word head. It was like he's the head, he's the middle, he's the complete. Now how would you say that? It wouldn't make sense if he was the leader. It makes sense. It's almost like saying the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Zeus is the source. Zeus is the middle. Zeus is complete. I mean, now all of a sudden, that's that same word being used in another context, and you can help identify. They're not saying Zeus is the leader. They're saying he's the beginning. He's the middle. He's the ultimate fulfillment, Zeus. Again, not our Christian doctrine, but the use of the word. Page 3, you can see at the bottom there, it's the source, and at the beginning is not the same thing as the head of state in our culture, the way they would see it. And that helps explain in these next verses then, the source of the Messiah, and that's what that very top of the page, the source of Christ, not the head, not the leader of Christ, but the source of Christ is God. So let's go back and read this. I'm going to go into this next verse 4 here and look at some other things. Let's go to chapter 11, verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings or the traditions, just as I pass them on to you. Now we got to think positive there. They're having church services. They're meeting together. They're celebrating the Lord's Supper. They're praying. They're prophesying. They separated themselves from the pagan community and have started a church and have started practicing the church. Okay, now that they're in church, he says, thank you. You're having church. But now I want you to realize that the head of every man, now again, not necessarily the leader, but the source. Again, don't have to accept what we're trying to teach this, trying to think through this. I want you to realize that the source of every man is Christ. This is going to play. Every man comes from Christ. Now again, we're going to assume Christian man, every believer in your community that's meeting together, every one of them, their source is Christ. And the source of the woman is man. Ultimately, I guess that's referring back to the beginning of time, when the source of every woman is man. And the source of Christ is God. The source of the Messiah, the Christos, is God. Now that's source. Let's go back and read another way. Let's say head, the leader, the authority. Now I want you to realize that the authority of every man is Christ. The leader of every man is Christ. The leader of the woman is man. The head of state over every woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. The leader of God is God. Now that's all fine, but do realize we're saying man and woman in general sense. It would mean every man in here and every woman in here would fit in this. You cannot, to make it even more complicated, you can go back there and change, that can be translated husband and wife. So now we read it this way. Again, I don't think this necessarily makes sense, but you've got to consider it. Now I want you to realize that the head of every husband is Christ, and the head of every wife is the husband, and the head of Christ is God. Or you could read the source. So you got several different ways of translating that. I'm just laying that out there for you. Hopefully sometime here in a little bit I'll draw some kind of conclusion. Okay, verse 4. Now he goes on. He just made a statement that you can't argue with. Although we don't know what he's saying. I mean, you can say this is what I think or this is what you think or whatever. But he just made a statement that to the Corinthians, you can't argue with this. The source of every man is Christ, or the head of every man is Christ. The source of every woman or wife is the man or the husband. And the source or the head of Christ is God. Everyone agree? And at that point, everyone in Corinth go, yes. But we say, wait, we can't translate that. We got like 500 ways of translating what you just said. But do you understand my point? Whatever he's just said is absolute. It's not like his opinion. This is like unarguable fact. This is the way it is. Okay, so with that, he's just made a statement with that. Because of that, okay. Verse 3. Now, verse 4. Because of that, verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved off, she should cover her head. So in other words, he's making some kind, now we're into the practice. Now, he says, thank you for having church services. Thank you for coming together and praying and meeting and having the Lord's Supper, just like I taught you. But now understand, when you meet together, do realize, and just gave that the scenario, head of every man is Christ, head of every woman is man, and head of Christ is God. So because of that, we got to make a correction. Understand, if you're a man in the church setting and you're covering your head, that's a disgrace. And we say, why? I mean, it's like, because of what I just said. Okay? And vice versa, if a woman prays or prophesies with her hair uncovered, that's a disgrace. She might as well shave her hair off. And you know what that means? It's a disgrace for her. So please, uncover and cover. Got it? Now you can imagine all the fallout we've had for 2,000 years, and you've met them. that, if you go to church, you got to have your, head covered and all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, maybe right. I don't want to be critical. I don't even know what I'm talking about, okay? But we got to go back. He is not thinking about 21st century. He's thinking 55 AD. He's not thinking in Jerusalem. He's thinking in Corinth. He's thinking about people that have just come out of pagan worship. And in 55 AD, what does it mean? And be careful as I say this. Because what I'm going to say is very important. And I may fluctuate, I may change. If we're talking about this right here, especially truth, there's no arguing for us. We need, it'd be nice if we understood it, but when we understand it, it's absolute doctrine. Women, cover up your heads. Men, don't cover up your heads and get a haircut. But if we're talking about social standards of the way the Corinthians do things and what hair and coverings mean in their Corinthian Roman society at that time, we now have some flexibility. Do you understand what I just said? The Bible is literally true. It's truth. We have to follow it. But if he's addressing absolute eternal truth, there's no argument. But if he's talking about how the Corinthians are applying this truth in their society and the way society is understanding it and what it represents in their church service, he's talking about a social standard which changes so fast today, what I'm saying, with Facebook and multimedia or mass media. So here we go. Back to the notes, please. Chapter 11, verse 4, we're on page 3. The men were not improperly wearing their hair, but the women were, apparently. The men are used as an example to contrast the women. Doesn't mean the women were wrong. It appears he's using the men as an example here, and the men are like they're doing it right, apparently. Although we're going to challenge that. And the women were the ones that he was trying to correct. Going down to that where those bullet points are. This is important, I think. In Roman religious culture, the covering of a man's head was, there's your word, it means the head covering. The top, the head, the covering, the veil, the head veil. And we can see, now we're not talking, again, be careful, is he bringing over Jewish customs? When he talks about the traditions I taught you, did he teach the Corinthian Greeks the Jewish cultures of the head covering is that what he's talking? Is that what he did? He taught them Jewish culture? I don't think so. I don't think he's saying you've got to be like the Jews. I think he's addressing this issue right here, the social standard. And here's what takes place. For example, in this time, a statue of Augustus has been found in Corinth showing the emperor with his head covered. So in other words, you can read on here, basically what would take place is they would have sometimes they'd have a toga. They'd wear the toga with all the folds in it, and they'd end up putting the toga would unfold up over the head. When you see a priest in a pagan situation in some of I got examples written down here, on murals or carvings in stone. The altar of peace in Rome, for example, has got a fresco on the wall near it that shows the priests and the people in the religious ceremony with their head covered. Plutarch, I've got that written down right here. Where's it at? There's a quote in here in one of those bullet points.
Last one.
Oh, the last one. Okay. It was, if this was the purpose or not, the head covering would help reduce the noise of animals being sacrificed. Right here. Plutarch writes that the pagan priest, now this is a quote by a historian at this time, the pagan priest would pull the cloth over his head to exclude the noise of animals as it was sacrificed. The cloth, or the head covering, the head veil, was often the upper folds of the toga. So when you see a priest or the elite, and many times in the Jews, you had to be like a priest in the line of Aaron to be a priest. In the pagans, if you were an elite, the emperor, once you became emperor, you could be the priest. It was more a social standing. And so if you wanted to look cool, if you wanted to look like you were an authority, if you wanted to look like you were one of the religious leaders, what would you do? You pull the head covering up. Augustus has his head covered. The altar of peace has got Romans with their heads covered. They probably originated, if I tie this all together, probably originated by the man who's doing the sacrificing, and he's got all these screaming animals just to cover up his head. Well, then you got everybody standing around with their heads uncovered, watching, but the man up front, he's got his head covered. Why? Man, it's so annoying. Man, I got animals screaming and I got blood all over. He's got his head covered. And so it became a sign of being in charge, of being the leader, of being the one who was the priest. You got the laity over here, but we're the clergy of the pagan temples. And so Augustus, when he has pictures of himself at different times, he has his head covered or his ears covered. In different places, especially in the altar of peace, their ears were covered. Well, now here comes these pagans. I got 1,000 examples just ran through my mind that I could say something funny and mock people. I'm going to skip that part. But you got these pagans becoming believers and joining the church. And now here, it's a fresh start. They maybe didn't make it over there. They weren't maybe one of the leaders over there, but they're coming in here. And now you got everybody praying and prophesying. And a man is going to now pray or prophesy publicly. What's he going to do? Because of his culture? Pull his toe to them. And he's going to say whatever he's going to say. It's like, ooh. He's like a priest. It's like, to that culture, it was like, oh, I don't know if this is right, but it would fit. It's like saying, I'm special. The focus is on me. I'm leading the assembly now because, look, my head's covered. And Paul is saying here, you're now taking attention away from Christ and what we're meeting for, and you're paying attention to yourself. I'm going to pray and prophesy, and like everyone pay attention up here. Look, I'm now in charge. I'm the clergy. I've got my head covered. So he says, no, that's a disgrace. You're disgracing your head, but you're disgracing your head, which is Christ. You're supposed to be focused on Christ. Don't be pulling the little scarf over your head like you're a pagan priest, like I'm in charge of the ceremony. That might be what he's saying. That could be part of the saying right there. So I write here, it appears that men were bringing pagan practices into the church to exalt themselves as the religious elite or the priest into the church community of wearing the head covering. So that, remember, these people just came out of the pagan. They're starting, Paul said, I praise you and everything. You're meeting, you're having church services, you're having the Lord's Supper, you're praying and prophesying, but come on. The source of every man is Christ. We're focused on Christ, and it's disgrace for a man to cover his head. It's like, it makes no sense to us because it is not cool in our culture to come into church and say, cover your head. But there are certain things in our culture that you do see. It's like, these are the common people, but I'm the elite. I have my helicopter pick me up and fly me away. I got to rush out the door because I'm so, whatever the culture is, maybe how you dress, whatever, it changes from culture to culture. Everybody's always trying to separate themselves from the common. That's why the trends change. People magazine changes, or the trends change because everybody's now wearing this. If I dress like that, I'll look like everybody else. So I'm going to separate myself from the crowd and dress a little different. And if you're popular in your People magazine, what's going to happen next week? Everybody's going to follow you, and you've got to do it again. And the trends just keep going in this circle of everybody trying to catch up. And basically, in their culture, 55 AD, potentially, the men this was a sign of elite. Augustus did it. The priests, the pagan temples did it. And now I'm going to prophesy, so I'm going to cover my head because I'm elite. Paul's saying, no, you're not elite. You're a member of the body. This is chapter 12, but we're going to address this in chapter 11, the Lord's Supper. You've got the elite over here neglecting these that aren't elite. You get into the gifts, the tongues, they're trying to separate themselves from the crowd. And Paul's saying, we're trying to get everybody into the crowd. We're trying to get everybody together. And people keep wanting to pull out of the crowd and say, but I'm special. I'm special. And Paul's saying, get back in the crowd, get your head uncovered, and get back in the crowd. So maybe it's not about women he's upset with, but the men who are trying to become elite in the community. And say, so what about women? Women's a different issue. Women don't cover their heads because they want to be spiritually elite. Women are covering their heads because they want to be modest. So basically, if a man covers his head, it's a disgrace. But if a woman uncovers her head, that's a disgrace for a different reason. Because now we get into why women are uncovering their hair to be proper and modest in their social. I'm thinking this whole thing's got to do with social standards. Is there anything that applies to us? It all applies to us. It's just that the things are different. It's not about us covering our heads. It's about us doing something else. Whatever it is, it's the same thing. For women, if they would end up having their hair down, would be immodest because it was a sign of being a loose woman, or the only time you saw a woman with her hair down would be in a bedroom type setting. Or when they would shave their heads, who would shave their heads? Well, we can read on in here, you can see Jews sometimes, to disgrace a woman, they would shave their heads. But why was shaving the woman's head a disgrace? Well, if you don't mind me saying it, this is not necessarily absolute, but this is the truth. It may play into this. Who shaved their heads? The women who were prostitutes would shave their heads. Why would you shave your head if you're a prostitute? So you can change characters. You can put on a different wig for different customers. It's like, put on the wig. It's like, I got this collection of wigs. What wig do you want? And they put a wig on. So a prostitute had a shaved head to wear a wig. So in other words, the woman's hair should be long and not shaved. But if you got long hair, it should be up and covered, either braided or up in some kind of a covering to say that your hair is modest, that you're not hanging down and being immodest, but covered and taken care of. So a man covering his head means you think you're a priest. A woman uncovering a head, it's like you're breaking social standards. Now again, the question comes up, why would you come into the church and not meet social standards? Again, that's another question that comes up, but why would the women be doing this? Well, possibly the answer is they weren't. It was more of a man's problem. The men were the ones trying to be the elite, and he's just using this as the example. It's vice versa, what many people have taught. Or it can be the women were coming in with this new freedom in Christ, breaking, and have you ever seen this before? Breaking with social standards because we're in the new age. Folks, we're not in the new age. We've been saved. We know the truth. We follow church tradition, and we're waiting for the coming kingdom. But we're not in the coming kingdom. We still drive the speed limit. We still follow social standards. When Jesus Christ comes, there will be, this could get you in trouble, there will be a world revolt. You know what I'm talking about? There will be. I'm not going to have a government takeover. I'm not stocking up ammunition. I'm not going to have a government takeover. I'm trying to live my life meeting social standards, meeting my government's expectations, anticipating this truth. But within my truth and my traditions, I am anticipating a day where the social standards are overthrown, not by me, but my soon coming king who will establish a new world order. And that's the revolt you need to be worried about, not me. I'm not planning a revolt. I'm not encouraging revolt. In fact, I'm encouraging meet the social standards. We have truth and we have traditions, but we're not trying to overthrow our culture. So you're saying culture's never be overthrown? No. It will be overthrown, but there's not a thing you can do about it. Just get ready. And I'd say accept the truth so you're ready for the social overthrow. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. See what time it is. It's time to wrap it up. Yes, please.
The Jews, the men always had the little beanie, had their hair covered. When did that change then, that it becomes wrong for the man to have his head covered?
Well, a real simple answer is we are in Corinth, in Greece country now. We are in another part of the world. See, the Jews in Jerusalem were of one culture following the Mosaic law. These people over here are a different culture. So what Paul is talking about is he's not handing off the traditions. He's not handing off to them Jewish traditions. He's handing off church traditions that they need to apply in their social setting, which is in Corinth, 55 AD, in a Greek culture. So I don't think this has anything to do with Jews and Greeks. In other words, potentially, again, this needs to be, I haven't done anything except stir the pot. You know what I'm saying? It's like this goes on forever. You get commentators going on, and we just try to put things together. What this is saying here, if I say anything, is the Jews have their culture, the Corinthians have their culture. Both have to take and adapt their culture, their social standards to the truth and the traditions that support this truth and then fit their social standings. In other words, Paul's saying to the Jews, he says, you don't need to become a Jew to be a Christian, nor do you need to become uncircumcised. He says, you don't need to be, he said that earlier. You don't need to do, and there's nothing you need to do here. Whatever your social standard is, meet the social standards with the truth and tradition. Now, you understand what I'm saying here? The standard, like if our standards are, we meet on Sundays, the pastor wears a suit and tie, then, if that's a sign of a pastor, a suit and tie and dressed up with a podium up front, do that. If you're going to meet the social standards, do that. It has nothing to do with truth and what's right or wrong. And so what's right or wrong in Jerusalem is different than what's in Corinth, which is definitely different than what's standard socials in America in 2014. This doesn't change, but this does. If that makes sense.
Yeah, other than this seems like a big deal here, head covered or not. How did that seem like a social standard that's brought into the church? Why did the Jews cover and still wear their little beanie. How did this come in?
The Jews wouldn't have been influenced by this. Because the Jews they're still going through they're reading their law. They're going to be like Moses, and the law of Moses and the things that were written down in there. Does anybody else want to say something? Anybody else want to? It'd be a great time for the second speaker to say something. Anybody else have an answer for that?
Covering yet, though.
Yeah. Because the Jews do have, they wear, what's that called again? They wear that, and they get that from their teaching, but it has nothing to do with what's going on in Corinth. They're getting that from... Now, for example, if you were going to go to Jerusalem, I don't think it's necessary to wear a head covering, but if you're going to go to Jerusalem and you're going to minister to the Jews, you may want to get a head covering on. Why? Because the first thing they're going to look at is your head covered. If your head's not covered, you're done. But I got the truth. Well, if you cover your head up, well, maybe listen to the truth. I mean, that's one of the things here. It's like you got to meet the social standards. And this changes. It goes back to even with and I'll say this and I'll quit when someone wants to say something. Like James, the one who wrote the book of James, Jesus' brother. It appears he continued to worship, as many of the Jews did in Jerusalem, they continued to worship on the Temple Mount. It's like, well, how could they continue to go to the Temple Mount when Jesus had died? And he was because their worship, their culture, their social standard all circled around the temple. And they could continue to follow their social standard of worshiping on the Temple Mount and still abide by the truth and traditions. But to take that and go to the Galatians and say, you've got to go to the temple, it's like, well, now you're teaching Jewish social standards as if it was truth and tradition. If you're a Jew and your name is James, he dies from getting pushed off the Temple Mount because he was still there on the day he died. He fell from the Temple Mount. So he was there his entire life. The Jews did not stop going to the temple just because they heard about Jesus Christ. They continued to worship on the Temple Mount. But even James and Paul agreed on this, but we're not going to take that teaching to the Gentiles. We're not going to take the Jewish culture to the Gentiles. They don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to follow the dietary laws. If you remember the letter in Acts, we just ask that they not be offensive to the Jewish brethren by eating food sacrificed to idols or food with blood still in it, or worshiping idols, and avoid sexual immorality. We just can't have that. But as far as the social standards of the Jews, they're not going to teach that, if that makes sense at all. So we've got social standards that are not truth and tradition, but we should follow them because that's the way our society functions. They're the way that the society understands it.
How do the Catholics get around this? They always have a big hat on when they're praying. Pope and everybody.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. If I was a Catholic, I'd say it was a social standard in 55 AD, and it's no longer a social standard it's now a sign of, well, it's still a sign of authority. It's still, even then, not every Catholic wears some kind of a hat. It's only those that have they may be actually bought into the whole system. Your head covered, you're now a priest. Again, I've given you some ideas here. I have not given you the final answer. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, there's different ways of approaching this right here. In fact, you go to what is the Brethren churches, right? Tony, the Brethren. We pastored Brethren church, but we were a different out branch when I was pastoring that church. But there is a group of brothers that the women all have their head covered because they read this as women having their head covered is not a social standard, it's an absolute. That if when you get to heaven, all women have their head covered, you get to heaven. Or well, I'm not sure what they think. But I think that's wrong. I think they misunderstood. I think there are other things in our culture today that I'll give you a classic example. I got to quit. The wedding ring is a classic example. My wife doesn't need to have her head covered in church because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything in our culture. But should she have her wedding ring on? Yeah. But why? Because that's a sign in our culture that means something. We're married. If my wife takes her ring off and goes to work, do you think there's a problem? It's like, yeah, there's a problem right there. And so does the Bible say wives wear wedding rings? There's nowhere it says wear a wedding ring. But our social standard is a wedding ring represents this certain truth. You are married to a man. Well, for her to break that social standard here would be wrong. You could see Paul saying, women, get your wedding rings back on. It's like, whoa, all women have to wear a wedding ring. Well, what happens if you go to a different culture, go down in another country even today, and they don't wear wedding rings? They have another sign of, maybe a sign is their head's covered that they're married. The wedding ring is not the message. The message is follow are you communicating truthfully with your society? Are you trying to hide something? If that makes sense. I'll quit because we could ramble on. We'll somehow pick this up next week, clean it up, and move on into the next section. I'd love to ask if there's any questions. And if you do have something serious, a serious question that you'd like to have me clean up or iron up, just send me an email, and then I'll delete that. I'll try and clean it up. Okay, I'll pray and then we're done. Father, we thank you so much again for the chance to look into your word. We ask that we may live our lives today as would be pleasing to you, that we'd follow the truth, we'd follow the traditions that communicate the truth, but Father, that we'd also communicate to our culture that we have a way of righteousness, have a way of living that they can also accept and follow without offending them. Father, we do ask that we may again live a life that is pleasing to you at this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much for being here.